Charlotte Kingsley had it all. A mansion, luxury, a future already written by her powerful surname. But inside her there was only emptiness, apathy, and the weight of never being enough for her father, Edward Kingsley, a ruthless millionaire who only believed in results. He had even forbidden his daughter from speaking to the cleaning lady's son, a 13-year-old boy named Billy Carter. But it was precisely this boy, invisible to everyone, who showed him a new way of seeing the world. And one night when father and daughter faced each other not in business, but on a chessboard, something happened. Edward laughed, certain of his victory. But Charlotte's next move would change the fate of the Kingsley family forever. High in the Fairfield Hills, the Kingsley mansion gleamed like a temple of glass and stone. The symmetrical garden exuded perfection, a source of pride and control for Edward Kingsley. On Monday morning, the tycoon gathered the team in the marble hall. The calm, sharp voice announced a new rule with no appeal. Children of employees are not allowed into the house under any circumstances. Betty Carter's gaze wavered, remembering her 13-year-old son waiting after school. Edward didn't notice, or pretended not to notice, as he always did with everything that didn't yield numbers. 16-year-old Charlotte Kingsley listened from afar while pretending to pay attention to her cell phone. The rule seemed distant, even banal. Another brick in the wall of ice that surrounded his life. The chef lined up symmetrical cutlery. The butler wrote it down without hesitation. Betty, hands steady but trembling inside, just nodded. The decree sounded like a dry crack, banishing Billy Carter's existence from the polished halls. For Edward, it was order and decorum. For Betty, it was fear of losing her job. For Charlotte, it was just silence, because almost everything about her was silence. And yet, that silence was about to be broken. Charlotte walked down the aisle of family portraits, where ancient victories posed like saints. She saw herself reflected in golden frames that didn't tell her story. He had everything money could buy and no motive that money could give. Her diary was overflowing with private lessons and invitations, but nothing touched her inside. At the coffee table, his father reviewed charts on a tablet, his eyes steely gray. "Another school report," he said without looking up. "Subpar math." Charlotte shrugged, shielding herself with the indifference she had learned to wear. "Try caring for once," he added, as polite as a court ruling. The word import echoed without landing. Everything seemed like acoustic cotton fabric. In recent memory, the decree on civil servants' children has reappeared, harsh, impeccable, sterile. Betty walked past with a bucket, her blue uniform absorbing the light like an apology. Charlotte noticed the quick shift of her gaze. There was a story there that the house wouldn't let her tell. Curiosity wasn't common in her, but something scratched the surface of the boredom. The crystal world began to reveal microcracks, invisible to the adult's haste. And through the cracks, a name rose like a whisper: Billy Carter. That afternoon, a light rain beat against the conservatory glass, and the sound was reminiscent of a sewing machine. Charlotte fled the screens and walked aimlessly to the two-story library. The smell of leather and old paper lingered like forgotten advice. In the background, he saw Betty discreetly polishing the baseboards, her movements precise as prayer. On a chair lay a notebook with a worn cover, streaked with pencil and coffee. It wasn't any guardian's. It was Billy's, left there when he was waiting for his mother in previous days. Charlotte opened it on impulse and found diagrams, arrows, questions that led to other questions. Mind maps connected books, music, movies, and little home science experiments. There were phrases from his grandfather, Professor Johnny Carter. Seeing is connecting. Memorizing is forgetting more slowly. The vivid handwriting seemed to speak directly to his ancient weariness. As you turn the page, A short note. If you want to learn to see, start with the smallest thing in the room. Charlotte looked up and saw only dust dancing in the light. Still, for the first time in months, I wanted to try. Outside, Edward signed contracts. Inside, another signature began to take shape, and the decree expelling Billy from the house without knowing it already set the stage for the impossible. Betty Carter walked through the marble corridors of the mansion as if she were treading on someone else's territory. His blue uniform hid both dignity and fatigue, and his steps were measured so as not to echo too much. I had learned, from an early age, that a good cleaning lady is one who disappears behind the shine she leaves behind. But nothing could erase the thought of Billy, waiting for her at home, surrounded by books borrowed from the public library. He always asked about the world he couldn't see. The gardens, the corridors, the music room with the grand piano. Betty responded with careful stories, like someone stepping over broken glass. Edward Kingsley's decree still burned in her like a hot iron. Billy could no longer even pass through the gates. There was no room for cleaning ladies' children in the world of millionaires. But Billy never complained. He just smiled with the calm of someone who was holding something bigger. "It's okay, Mom. As long as I have my notebooks, I'm home." Betty looked at him and recognized in the boy the same flame as his deceased father, an inheritance from Professor Johnny Carter. It was this flame that made her endure humiliations, because she knew that Billy's wisdom could not be extinguished. Still, her heart dreaded the day her son's talent would clash with the Kingsley pride. And that day approached without her being able to stop it. The glass mansion had porous walls, and secrets began to seep through. Charlotte held Billy's forgotten notebook like someone who had found a treasure map. Each page seemed woven with connections that defied the tedium in which she was drowning. As she read about bridges between science, music, and philosophy, something in her clicked. It was as if the apathy that paralyzed her gave way to a new restlessness. The simple notes had more life than any lecture he had heard in class. Charlotte felt ashamed as she remembered the low grades she had collected out of sheer indifference. There, before the scribble of a boy who had never had expensive tutors, she saw herself as small. Small, but strangely free, as if she could choose differently. He turned the page and read another underlined sentence. "The smallest thing can teach the greatest secret." Her eyes swept the room and landed on a smudge on the window pane. It was just dust, but now it seemed like a riddle to be solved. An inner whisper told him that this forbidden boy had something to show. It was impossible not to be attracted to this mystery. Charlotte didn't know it yet, but the emptiness that suffocated her was beginning to break, and the first crack was named after Billy Carter. In the evening, Edward Kingsley returned to the mansion laden with urgent reports and messages. He didn't notice his daughter's silence, as she stared at the notebook hidden under her pillow. For Edward, Charlotte was a line of family continuity. She was to inherit not only the fortune, but the discipline. "Failure doesn't run in Kingsley's blood," he always said, as if it were a prayer. He never would have imagined that the source of change for his daughter would come from his cleaning lady's son. Charlotte, in her room, felt torn. On one side, the father's stern voice demanding excellence. On the other, the scribbled words of a 13-year-old boy. Billy's sentences didn't sound like a rule, but like an invitation. She read them in secret like someone who was keeping a dangerous offense. And it was dangerous indeed. If Edward found out, there would be no forgiveness. Charlotte closed her notebook and turned off the light, but she couldn't sleep. Each page seemed to breathe within her, igniting thoughts that had not existed before. The prohibition made in the mansion's hall was no longer a barrier. In the shadow of the night, the seed of an unlikely alliance was born, and this alliance would soon be put to the test. The next morning brought a gray, heavy sky, as if the house itself sensed change. Charlotte walked through the empty hallways, Billy's notebook hidden between her arms. She felt strange, torn between obeying her father's rules and the need to know who had written those words. The decree echoed in his memory. No children of employees should be there. And yet every line in the notebook seemed to mock that order, begging to be discovered. In the backyard, near the laundry room, Charlotte heard a low voice reciting verses. Curious, she followed the sound until she found a boy sitting on wooden boxes, pencil in hand. It was Billy Carter, drawing geometric shapes while muttering passages from a science book. The worn uniform betrayed simplicity, but the sparkle in his eyes betrayed an entire hidden world. Charlotte hesitated, as if crossing a forbidden line. But when Billy looked up, there was no fear in them, only quiet surprise. "You're Charlotte, aren't you?" he said, as if it were natural to speak to the heiress. She nodded nervously, clutching the notebook to her chest. "I found this in the library. Is it yours?" Billy's eyes lit up, not with embarrassment, but with unexpected joy. Charlotte held out the notebook, and the silence between them seemed bigger than the entire garden. Billy received him with care, as if he were recovering a piece of his own soul. "Did you read it?" he asked, his voice calm but full of expectation. Charlotte hesitated before admitting, "Yes, I didn't understand everything, but I couldn't stop." A slight smile appeared on the boy's lips. "My grandfather used to say that ideas are seeds. If one sticks in your head, it's worth it." The heiress felt disarmed. Never had a tutor, never a teacher spoken to her like that. It was not condescension nor order. It was sharing. Charlotte looked around, afraid to be seen. If Edward appeared, they would both be in trouble. But at that moment, his father's prohibition seemed distant, almost unimportant. Billy sensed her uneasiness and lowered his voice. "Don't be afraid. Sometimes the greatest discoveries come when we break a rule." She laughed awkwardly, surprised by his boldness. Little by little, the stiffness in his chest began to ease. And for the first time in a long time, Charlotte really wanted to learn. What was born there was not just friendship. It was a silent pact against emptiness. The rest of the day was a maze of thoughts. Charlotte walked through the mansion, but her mind was stuck on the conversation in the courtyard. Billy's sentences reverberated like bells, clear and impossible to ignore. At the dinner table, Edward talked about meetings, mergers, and new contracts. She just nodded, but inside she was building questions she didn't dare ask aloud. In the library, he looked through the books as if they were locked safes. He thought of Billy, opening each one not with keys, but with curiosity. Suddenly, the luxury that surrounded her seemed smaller, meaningless. What was so much gold worth, if a boy with a pencil and paper could teach more than any tutor? Charlotte knew she needed to see him again, even though the risk was enormous. Edward's decree made each meeting clandestine, but also more necessary. For the first time, there was something she wanted for herself, not to please her father. And this desire grew indomitable like a root in asphalt. The Kingsley story began to be rewritten in secret, line by line, and the next page awaited. It was early when Charlotte walked out the side door of the mansion, the sun still shy over the gardens. He carried a hidden nervousness, like someone carrying contraband in his heart. In the corner of the lot, near the old oak tree that almost no one visited, Billy was already waiting for her. The simple school uniform contrasted with the luxurious setting, but there was a firmness to it. He held an empty glass vial, which to anyone else seemed insignificant. "Today you will learn to see," he said calmly, without formal greetings. Charlotte raised her eyebrows in disbelief. "With a bottle?" Billy smiled patiently. With your attention." He led her to the foot of the oak tree, where the grass was wet with dew. "Look at the ground. What do you see?" he asked. "Grass, earth, dirt," he replied impatiently. "Look again, but without rushing. Don't see things. See stories." Charlotte took a deep breath, leaned forward, and stared. Suddenly, he noticed an ant carrying a piece of leaf much larger than itself. She felt strangely touched by it. Billy then pointed to the jar. "Keep what you find." Charlotte laughed, finding it absurd. "How am I going to keep a story in a jar?" But he only gave her an encouraging look. She picked a small purple flower that was growing in the grass, tiny and almost invisible. He placed it inside the jar, and in doing so, he felt as if he had protected a secret. Billy explained, "My grandfather used to say that the world speaks softly. Those who don't learn to listen lose what's most precious." Charlotte looked at the flower and for the first time thought that perhaps there was beauty in things she had never noticed. She felt a pang of shame. She had spent her life surrounded by gold, but she had never stopped to listen to the world. Billy continued, "Your father's mansion may be huge, but the universe fits into one detail." His words sounded like riddles that demanded an answer. Charlotte didn't answer. She just kept the bottle as if she were holding a rare jewel. There, in the silence, she realized that she was being initiated into a learning process that no teacher had dared to teach. And a spark lit in the depths of her eyes, as if a new Charlotte had just been born. In the afternoon, the mansion's routine continued as always, impeccable and cold. Edward Kingsley walked through the halls talking on the phone about stocks and million-dollar mergers. Charlotte watched him silently, and something seemed different in her perception. She noticed the tiredness hidden in the corners of his eyes, a weight that no one dared comment on. It was as if Billy's exercise had sharpened his senses, opening doors to see beyond the surface. In the library, he was still holding the bottle with the purple flower. The small object seemed to scream meanings that expensive books hadn't shown him. She wondered what else was hidden in the details of life that she had always ignored. On the table lay the report card Edward had left with the cold notation, "Unsatisfactory." Charlotte, for the first time, read it not with indifference, but with uneasiness. If Billy could teach so much with so little, what was his excuse? Deep in his chest, he felt not only curiosity, but a strange sense of responsibility. And, along with it, fear. Edward would never accept knowing that the cleaner's son had become his daughter's secret master. It was a dangerous game, and with each lesson, Charlotte advanced deeper into it. The metallic sound of cutlery, pots banging, and orders being shouted echoed through the kitchen of the Kingsley mansion. The French chef, irritable and perfectionist, commanded his assistants like an impatient conductor. It was an environment where Charlotte never lingered. She always crossed quickly, disturbed by the noise. That day, however, Billy was there, discreetly, waiting for his mother to finish the job. He waved to her with a simple gesture, inviting her to come closer. "Close your eyes," he said softly, almost swallowed by the noise of the pots. Charlotte looked around nervously. If anyone saw them together, there would be trouble. But curiosity got the better of her. She closed her eyes, crossing her arms defensively. "Now listen," Billy continued. "No noise. Listen to the story." She frowned in confusion. Still, she concentrated. The first sound he noticed was that of knives cutting vegetables, steady, sure. Then, the awkward clink of a spoon falling to the floor, accompanied by a nervous sigh. The hiss of hot oil seemed to scream urgency. And behind it all, the chef's voice, hard, repeating orders like a war general. Charlotte opened her eyes, surprised by the sudden clarity. "They're not just cooking," he murmured. "They're surviving." Billy smiled. "Exactly. Sound is more than sound. It's fear, it's respect, it's haste, it's dedication." She felt a strange thrill, as if she had learned a secret language. Everything that had always sounded like noise now revealed itself as narrative. Charlotte noticed sweat running down the face of a young assistant, trembling as he stirred a pot. He also saw the almost poetic concentration of another employee, delicately cutting herbs despite the chaos. Suddenly, they were no longer invisible employees. They were protagonists of silent battles. "My grandfather used to say that paying attention turns everything into learning," Billy added. Charlotte thought about how many times she had walked through the kitchen without noticing any of this. She felt small but also awake. "You have good eyes, Charlotte. You just need to learn to listen too," the boy concluded. She looked at him, still startled by what she had discovered in such a short time. "It was as if I was discovering the world for the first time, inside my own home. And deep down, I knew I could never be the same again." That night, Edward Kingsley ate dinner alone in silence. Charlotte remained in front of her plate, not hungry, lost in thought. She could still hear the sounds from the kitchen in her mind as if they were echoing off the walls. Suddenly, he saw his father in a different light. Not just as a tycoon, but as a man. He noticed the impatient rhythm with which he tapped his fingers on the table, his short, heavy breathing. It was as if he could hear the story behind it too. Pressure, exhaustion, pride. She wanted to ask if everything was okay, but fear held her back. Still, the exercise had made her realize that her father wasn't just an ice statue. He too was caught in some invisible chaos like the kitchen staff. Charlotte went upstairs to her room, carrying with her an uncomfortable certainty. The world was not just made of appearances, it was made of hidden layers. And Billy Carter was giving him the keys to see them. But with each discovery, the risk of Edward realizing what was happening also grew, and a confrontation seemed increasingly inevitable. Edward Kingsley's office was a forbidden sanctuary within the mansion. The walls were lined with dark leather shelves and corporate trophies that gleamed under the controlled lighting. Framed pictures displayed Edward alongside presidents, tycoons, and leadership awards. Charlotte rarely dared to enter, but that night curiosity overcame fear. Billy had challenged her to look through walls, and she wanted to test the lesson. He pushed the door open cautiously and smelled the scent of cigars in the air. The silence seemed heavier than marble. She walked slowly, her eyes wandering over the photos that had always seemed like distant trophies to her. Now, I tried to see beyond the frame. There was one photograph in particular. A younger Edward standing in front of a makeshift shed piled with cables and papers. The look was not cold as it was now. It was that of a man exhausted, but burning with ambition. Charlotte stood still, absorbing that image she had always ignored. Suddenly, his father didn't seem like an unattainable giant, but a man who had started from nothing. And something in his heart moved, breaking the usual ice. Billy appeared discreetly in the doorway, brought by Betty to help with the cleanup. Charlotte called him over with a quick gesture and showed him the photograph. "He was like this before? Can you believe it?" he whispered, as if sharing a dangerous secret. Billy watched intently and replied without hesitation, "It's the same person, only now he's stuck chasing his own victories." The words pierced Charlotte like silent arrows. He had never thought of his father as someone imprisoned by his own actions. "My grandfather used to say that pride can be a prison, and trophies can become bars," Billy added. Charlotte swallowed, realizing she saw Edward in a completely new way. On the side wall, he found another, older photo, Edward as a child next to a man with a hard expression. The boy held a report card, looking at his father with a mixture of fear and hope. Charlotte shivered. It echoed her own life. The same billing cycle repeated itself generation after generation. And for the first time, she realized that perhaps her father was not only the executioner, but also the victim. A victim of a history that never learned to question. That night, Charlotte returned to the room differently. The office, which had always seemed like an inaccessible throne, was now a mirror. Billy's words echoed. He's stuck behind his own victories. She thought about her father's demands, the coldness of their conversations, and saw something hidden in them. It wasn't just contempt. It was fear, the same fear the boy in the photo carried in his eyes. Charlotte lay down with a heavy heart, but also with a new strength emerging. Perhaps she wasn't as weak as she imagined, nor was her father as invincible as he seemed. Billy's notebook lay beside his bed, like a silent guide. She knew that this discovery couldn't stop there. She needed to go deeper. But he also knew that Edward would never allow this closeness with the cleaning lady's son. With each step, the tension increased like a taut rope about to snap. And Charlotte felt that the time for this rope to snap was getting closer and closer. The perfect glass world was cracking. And through the cracks, finally, light entered. The history classroom at Northwood Academy was cold and spotless, like everything else bearing the Kingsley name. Charlotte entered with her head down, already accustomed to being just the millionaire's daughter who never cared. The teacher, Mr. Walker, explained about the Industrial Revolution, while his classmates whispered and played with their cell phones. It was just another ordinary day, until Charlotte remembered Billy's words. Look not at the facts, but at the bridges between them. She looked up at a photograph projected on the screen. Exhausted, soot-covered workers in a crowded factory. Before, it would have gone unnoticed. This time, something different happened. Charlotte saw not only their dirty faces, but the weight on their shoulders, the calloused hands, the look of someone who already knew the future. Impulsively, he raised his hand. The entire room fell silent. They don't just look tired, he said firmly. They look like they're under sentence. There was no choice for them. It was work or starvation. The professor stared at her, surprised. He had never heard Charlotte speak like that. Some colleagues laughed, thinking it was a joke. But she continued, undaunted. Look at the boy in the corner. He must be about 12. He's not looking at the camera, he's looking at the man next to him. Maybe his father. He already sees in his father's face what his whole life will be like. The laughter died in the room, replaced by a heavy silence. Even Kyle Benson, the classmate who most enjoyed making fun of her, stood there speechless. The professor approached the table with an expression of mixed surprise and admiration. Miss Kingsley, that is a remarkable analysis, he said, almost stammering. Charlotte felt her cheeks burn, but also a different heat in her chest. It wasn't shame, it was something close to pride, but not the cold pride his father displayed. It was genuine satisfaction, as if he had finally found his own voice. She remembered the afternoons with Billy, the exercises of seeing the invisible, and realized she was applying them without even thinking. Her classmates watched her with a new curiosity, and Charlotte realized that for the first time she was not just the wealthy heiress. It was someone with something to say. The teacher concluded, "That's the difference between memorizing dates and understanding stories. Well done, Charlotte." She lowered her eyes, but her heart was on fire. It was as if he had breathed fresh air after years in a closed room. At the end of the class, he heard murmurs. Who would have thought? Charlotte Kingsley was serious, and even though some mocked, the seed had already sprouted. Billy Carter was changing his life from the inside out, and not even Edward, with all his power, could stop this silent process. That night, when she arrived home, Edward was waiting for her in the dining room. He held a sheet of paper in his hand, the updated school report. Charlotte felt her stomach churn. "I see there's been an unexpected improvement," Edward said, his tone emotionless. She almost answered, almost told him about Billy, but swallowed the words. His father would never accept it. For Edward, merit could only come from renowned teachers, not from a 13-year-old boy. Charlotte just nodded, holding the secret like someone holding a flame against the wind. And as Edward talked about finals, she knew she was preparing for something much bigger. The transformation was underway, invisible to him, but impossible to stop. The mansion's garden was lit by discreet lights when Charlotte found Billy sitting near the greenhouse. He scribbled something in his notebook, while the wind blew leaves across the ground. Charlotte approached, still carrying the weight of the class in which she had first spoken with conviction. "Today, I was able to see just like you said," he said, trying to hide his excitement. Billy looked up and smiled, but his answer wasn't what she expected. "You succeeded, but not completely. You still speak to impress others, not to truly understand." Charlotte frowned, offended by the bluntness. "You don't know what it's like to be in that room, with everyone looking at me. I needed to show that I'm not a failure." Billy closed the notebook slowly, staring at her with unexpected serenity for a 13-year-old boy. "My grandfather used to say that pride is the highest wall. As long as you try to prove something, you won't see anything." Words hurt more than any scolding from a teacher. Charlotte crossed her arms, as if to protect herself. For the first time, he realized that the transformation he sought would require more than pretty phrases. It would require humility, something he had not learned to cultivate. She took a deep breath, trying to argue. "But how am I going to live without pride? Wouldn't that be erasing myself completely?" Billy shook his head calmly. "It's not about erasing. It's about ceasing to be a reflection in the mirror. It's about starting to be a window." Charlotte was silent, absorbing the enigma. He felt a mixture of anger and fascination. He wanted to reject those lessons, but he couldn't. His gaze was steady, as if he knew she carried fear behind her arrogance. "Do you think I can change?" he asked, almost in a whisper. "If I couldn't, I wouldn't be here," Billy replied simply and confidently. These words completely disarmed her. Charlotte felt tears burning in her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. She realized that pride had protected her for years, but it had also blinded her. And for the first time, she admitted to herself that she needed to learn how to break down that wall. There, in front of the son of the cleaning lady, whom her father had forbidden from being there, Charlotte began to shed the weight of her surname. And in the void that was left, something new was ready to be born. That night, he went upstairs to his room in silence. He put Billy's notebook under his pillow and went to bed without turning on the light. The words about pride echoed like hammers inside his head. She remembered her father's cold expression as he handed her reports, as if her life were just a line on a spreadsheet. Was Edward also trapped in his own pride, unable to see what truly mattered? Charlotte closed her eyes, imagining the man in the old photograph in the office, still young and hungry to succeed. She realized that perhaps the pride wasn't just hers. It was a legacy that ran through generations of Kingsleys, and now it was up to her to break that cycle. As he fell asleep, he felt fear but also courage. It was like being at the top of a tall ladder. "I didn't know what I would find when I went down, but I knew I had to try." And he also knew that, at some point, Edward would find out everything. The silence of the mansion hid a war about to explode, and Charlotte was already in the center of it. Edward Kingsley sat in the dining room, the newspaper open before him, but his eyes fixed on Charlotte. He had noticed something different about his daughter. The way she looked, as if listening to the silence, as if searching for something beyond the glass walls. The transformation was subtle, but impossible to hide from a control-obsessed man. "I got a report from school," he said, folding the newspaper with almost military precision. "Apparently you opened your mouth in class." Professor Walker was impressed. Charlotte felt her heart race. She hadn't expected that this small victory had already reached her father. "It was just an observation," he replied, trying to sound nonchalant. Edward narrowed his eyes, studying his daughter's every gesture as if it were a suspicious investment. "An observation that doesn't square with your history of mediocre grades and chronic disinterest." He leaned across the table, his gaze as cold as ice. "Who's helping you?" Charlotte froze. The words were too sharp, dangerously close to the truth. She took a deep breath, trying to sustain the silence. But the father continued, "Do you think I don't notice? Changes never happen without a cause." Charlotte lowered her eyes, afraid her voice would betray her. I imagined Billy's face, the notebook full of notes, the bottle with the little flower. All of this had to remain a secret. If Edward found out, the punishment wouldn't fall on her alone. Betty would lose her job. Billy would be kicked out of the mansion forever. And what Charlotte feared most, the newly lit flame within her would be extinguished before it could even grow. "There is no one," he said firmly, trying to sound convincing. Edward stared at her for long seconds, searching for cracks in his daughter's disguise. Finally, he leaned back in his chair, but he didn't look satisfied. "Don't lie to me, Charlotte. I've built empires detecting lies." She swallowed hard, knowing the battle was just beginning. In that moment, he realized that he wasn't just learning from Billy, he also needed to protect him. It was a power play against the most ruthless man she had ever met. And one mistake could destroy everyone around you. That night, Charlotte went upstairs to her room with heavy steps. He leaned against the door and let his body fall onto the bed, his heart racing. For the first time, he felt real fear, not of his father, but of the strength of the truth he was hiding. Billy's secret was now part of her identity, something that defined her more than any last name. She opened the notebook again, the scribbles illuminated by the lamplight. Among drawings and phrases, a note caught attention. "Those who see do not fear the shadow." Charlotte closed her eyes, repeating the words like a mantra. I knew Edward's shadow was approaching, thicker every day. And yet, a new fire burned within her, refusing to be extinguished. If her father was forcing her to live on a chessboard of power, perhaps it was time to learn to move her own pieces. And in this game, Billy Carter was the key Edward could never have imagined. In the glass-enclosed hall of the mansion, there was a forgotten corner, where a dusty chessboard lay. Edward used to play against software on the tablet, bragging about beating machines, but Charlotte had never been interested. One silent afternoon, he found Billy there, observing the pieces as if deciphering a secret map. "Do you play?" she asked curiously, remembering her father's suspicion. Billy smiled slightly. "I've been playing since I was little. My grandfather used to say that chess is life in miniature. Pride loses out to patience." Charlotte laughed, but sat across from him, accepting the challenge. The white pieces were hers, the black ones were Billy's. In the first few moves, Charlotte acted in haste, advancing her queen and rooks as if she wanted to prove something. Billy just defended, watching calmly. "You attack like your father negotiates. Fast and aggressive," he commented calmly. Charlotte bit her lip, feeling exposed. When he realized it, his pieces were trapped by moves that seemed too simple. "Check," Billy announced, a calm gleam in his eyes. Charlotte was stunned. How could she lose so quickly to a 13-year-old boy? "You play as if you were at war with the board." Billy explained, replacing the pieces. But the secret is not to attack all the time. It's to wait for the right moment. Charlotte crossed her arms, irritated by the defeat. I don't like to lose, he grumbled. Billy chuckled. Nobody likes it, but losing is part of the game. You learn more from falling than from winning. She frowned, reluctantly absorbing the lesson. Inside, she felt touched. No one had ever turned her failure into a learning experience so simply. They tried again, and this time Charlotte took a deep breath, trying to apply what she had heard. He observed more, took fewer risks, and little by little began to understand the rhythm of the game. He didn't win, but he managed to escape the check for longer, earning a look of approval from Billy. Now you are learning to see, he said, pleased. Charlotte smiled for the first time in days, a genuine smile that didn't come from gifts or paternal praise. It was the feeling of real growth achieved with effort. And the board became more than a game. It was a secret battlefield, hidden from Edward's eyes, where, piece by piece, Charlotte discovered that she could be more than the last name Kingsley. At night, alone in her room, Charlotte couldn't sleep. I kept mentally reviewing every move of the match, every piece of advice from Billy. It was as if chess had revealed not just a strategy, but a new way of living. He thought about his father, his meetings and quick decisions, and wondered, did he also play to win at any cost? Or had he forgotten, somewhere in his life, the art of waiting? Charlotte closed her eyes, but she couldn't erase the glow of the match from her mind. He realized that, with each lesson, his view of the world expanded. The apathy that had once held her back was slowly being replaced by something rare. Purpose. And this purpose came precisely from the person the father had forbidden from being there. It was a risk, a dangerous secret, but Charlotte no longer saw any possible return. I was learning to play not just on the board, but in life. And he knew that, sooner or later, he would have to face the most difficult match, against his own father. The wall clock struck 7 o'clock when Edward Kingsley entered the dining room. Charlotte was already at the table, but instead of looking at her plate, her eyes were on the chessboard she had hidden. The pieces were carefully aligned, as if awaiting a silent confrontation. Edward frowned as he noticed the object. "Since when have you been interested in this?" he asked, his voice thick with suspicion. Charlotte took a deep breath. She could lie, but for the first time she chose to risk a partial truth. "Since I realized that chess isn't just a game. It's a way of thinking." Edward arched his eyebrow, intrigued but not pleased. "And who taught you that? It certainly wasn't at school, where your grades continue to be poor." Charlotte clenched her fists under the table, remembering Billy's calm smile. "The board taught me," he replied firmly. Edward let out a short, ironic laugh. "You speak as if you've discovered some profound secret. The real world isn't a chessboard, Charlotte. It's a battlefield where only the strong win." But, unlike other times, Charlotte did not remain silent. Maybe the strong aren't those who always attack. Maybe they're those who know how to wait. Silence fell heavily in the room, and Edward stared at her as if he didn't recognize his own daughter. There was a firmness in her tone, a spark he hadn't seen in years. "Don't repeat cliches to me," he said, his voice sharp. "I don't tolerate baseless arrogance." Charlotte looked up, meeting the storm in her father's eyes. "These aren't ready-made phrases. They're things I learned by observing." It was a simple answer, but each word felt like a blade piercing Edward's pride. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the marble. "Observing?" he repeated, almost accusingly. "And what exactly are you observing?" Charlotte hesitated for a second, but maintained her composure. "Everything you never have time to see," he said with cutting calm. Edward took a deep breath, his jaw clenched. For the first time in a long time, he couldn't find the words to end the discussion. He turned and left the room without finishing dinner, his hard footsteps echoing through the halls. Charlotte remained alone, her heart racing, but unrepentant. I knew that little daring move was just the beginning. Later, he went upstairs to his room carrying the board with him. The confrontation with Edward still throbbed in his mind, but strangely, he felt no fear. It was as if she had taken her first step out of his shadow. When he opened Billy's notebook, he found a sentence scrawled in crooked letters. The first movement towards freedom is always the riskiest, but also the most necessary. Charlotte smiled slightly, almost relieved. He was finally learning to play his own game. And although there was still risk, the taste of rebellion was too sweet to forget. She knew Edward wouldn't sit still. His distrust would grow until it became a storm. But now, for the first time, Charlotte felt she was prepared to face the rain. It was a cold morning, and the mansion was quieter than usual. Charlotte went downstairs with Billy's notebook hidden under her coat, planning to meet him in the back garden. But Edward was already waiting for her in the lobby, impeccable in his gray suit, his face full of suspicion. "You walk differently, Charlotte," he began, his voice low and dangerous, more attentive, less apathetic. She even dared to confront me at dinner. "I want to know, who's behind this?" Charlotte tried to remain calm, but her heart was pounding like a drum. "There's no one, Dad. I'm just looking more." Edward narrowed his eyes and suddenly snatched the coat from her hands with unexpected speed. The notebook fell to the floor, scattering pages scribbled with drawings, phrases, and diagrams. The silence that followed was piercing. Edward picked up the notebook and flipped through it, immediately recognizing Billy's childish handwriting. His expression became a mask of contained fury. "So that's it. The cleaning lady's son." The words sounded like poison. "I forbade this child from this house, and yet you make him your master." Charlotte felt her face flush with anger and embarrassment. "He's not just a child. He taught me to see. Something all his tutors, all his money, never could." Edward slammed his notebook against the table, the sound echoing through the hall like thunder. "Do you have any idea how ridiculous this is? The Kingsley heiress, tutored by a 13-year-old boy who cleans corners of the floor with his mother." Charlotte bit her lip, but didn't back down. "Maybe that's exactly what makes me different, Dad. He shows me what no one here has the courage to see." Edward's gaze was an abyss. "You don't understand the danger you're creating. The line between us and them exists for a reason. Mixing the worlds only brings ruin." His words hurt, but they also revealed his invisible prison, the fear of breaking barriers. Charlotte took a deep breath and faced her father bravely. Perhaps ruin is living surrounded by walls and never seeing beyond them. For a moment, Edward was silent, as if he had not expected such firmness. But he soon recovered, the steel mask back on his face. "This ends today," he declared. "Tomorrow Betty Carter will be dismissed, and the boy will never set foot here again." Charlotte felt the world collapse inside her chest. The image of Billy came to her mind. The serene smile, the notebook full of seeds of wisdom, the chessboard. Everything would be ripped away from her at once. He wanted to scream, to beg, but his voice failed him. Edward was already going upstairs, ending the conversation with his usual coldness. Alone in the lobby, Charlotte hugged the notebook to her chest, tears streaming silently. It was as if he was about to lose not only a friend, but his very chance to transform himself. And deep down, he knew Edward wouldn't back down easily. The final confrontation was approaching, and this time Charlotte couldn't just watch. She would have to fight. Charlotte spent the night awake, lying in bed with Billy's notebook clutched to her chest. Each page seemed to pulse like a living heart, carrying the lessons that had awakened her. But Edward's sentence echoed in his mind. Betty would be dismissed. Billy would never return. Dawn brought only more anguish. When he found Billy in the garden, his eyes reflected calm, but also a glint of challenge. "My father found out," Charlotte confessed, her voice breaking. "He's going to send you away." Billy took a deep breath, as if he had already expected this. "Then we have little time," he replied firmly. Charlotte despaired. "You don't understand. He could ruin your mother's life. I can't let that happen because of me." Billy placed his hand on her shoulder, with the serenity of someone far beyond his years. "You didn't ruin me, Charlotte. You listened to me. That's more than most would do." Tears streamed down her eyes, feeling helpless. But Billy smiled, almost ironically. "My grandfather always said that when the king threatens, it's because he's already afraid of losing the game." Betty appeared in the distance, carrying a tray of cloths and cleaning products, oblivious to the gathering turmoil. Charlotte ran to her, overcome with despair. "Ma'am, don't let him do this. I'll beg my father. I'll kneel if I have to." Betty stopped, surprised by the girl's intensity. His eyes, tired but firm, softened with tenderness. "Charlotte, this isn't the first time a man like your father has threatened us, and it won't be the last." She held the young heiress's hands. "What matters isn't whether or not we stay in this mansion. It's what you do with what you've learned." The words sounded like a silent verdict. Charlotte wanted to protest, but Betty's conviction silenced any argument. Billy stepped closer, adding, "Don't just fight to keep me here. Fight to keep what you've already found inside you." Charlotte realized, with a pang, that they were ready to go if necessary. But she wasn't ready to let them go. She knew she needed to react, not just for them, but for herself. Night fell, and the mansion seemed colder than ever. Charlotte locked herself in her room, the chessboard spread out before her. She moved the pieces alone, mentally repeating each of Billy's teachings. He realized that life, like the game, was made of sacrifices, and perhaps hers was about to happen. But he also understood that patience could turn into an attack at the right moment. She held the pawn between her fingers, determined. If Edward wanted to turn their lives into ruin, she would make it her first great battle. No longer as the apathetic daughter, but as someone who had finally learned to see. Looking out the window, he saw Billy in the garden, sitting beside his mother, serene despite the threat. And he felt the fire inside him grow. If the father believed he had won, he was mistaken. Charlotte prepared for the counterattack, the unexpected move that would change everything. Edward Kingsley entered the main hall with firm steps, the icy gaze of someone certain of victory. He called Charlotte over with a simple gesture of his hand, as if it were just another business meeting. On the coffee table lay the chessboard she had purposely left open. "Interesting choice of setting," he said, adjusting his tie. Charlotte approached slowly, her heart racing, but without showing any fear. "You always said life is a battle," he replied firmly. "Then let's play. And if I win, Betty and Billy stay." Edward let out a dry, sarcastically sneered laugh. "You think you can negotiate with me based on a child's game? But since you insist, I'll accept. That way you'll learn the difference between playing and commanding." He sat down, picking up the black pieces with the authority of someone who always believes he is in control. Charlotte sat down across from him, taking a deep breath. He felt the weight of the moment. It wasn't just a game, it was a chance to prove that he had learned to see. Billy, hidden behind the half-open door, watched silently, his eyes fixed on the table. It was more than a game, it was destiny. The first movements revealed the essence of each one. Edward attacked aggressively, opening a path for the queen early on, seeking to corner his daughter quickly. Charlotte, remembering Billy's lessons, resisted the temptation to move forward too soon. He moved his pawns patiently, building invisible walls. Edward laughed, mocking her slowness. "You play like someone who fears losing, Charlotte, and those who fear are already defeated." But she didn't answer. She let the silence work for her. Little by little, the father's impetuous attacks began to crash into small traps. A knight was captured, then a rook, and Edward began to frown. Charlotte, for her part, felt calm growing within her. Each piece moved was not just strategy, but a living memory of the nights in the garden, of Billy's words. "Look at the whole, not just the attack," she repeated mentally. Edward noticed the change and leaned forward, finally taking the match seriously. The entire room seemed to shrink around them, as if the entire world depended on that board. The game progressed, and the silence was broken only by the dry sound of the pieces landing on the board. Charlotte purposely sacrificed a rook, luring the king into a narrow corridor. Edward smiled, thinking he was about to win. But it was at that moment that Charlotte moved a simple pawn, revealing a silent trap. Edward's king was cornered. "Checkmate," Charlotte said, her voice low but firm, like suppressed thunder. For a second, Edward stood still, unable to believe what he saw. The previously arrogant eyes blinked in disbelief. Charlotte, for the first time, held his gaze without wavering. "It's not about always attacking, Dad. It's about knowing how to wait." The silence that followed was absolute. Billy, on the other side of the door, held his breath, a small, proud smile playing on his lips. The heiress everyone called apathetic had won, and the king of Kingsley Manor had just been defeated by the most unlikely move of his life. Edward stood motionless before the board, his eyes fixed on the checkmate he had just suffered. The room felt colder, as if even the walls were waiting for his reaction. Charlotte, sitting in front, didn't flinch. Her heart was pounding, but her posture was firm and serene. The silence stretched on, until Edward finally pushed his chair back with a sudden movement. "It was luck," he murmured, trying to hide the shock in his voice. Charlotte took a deep breath, gathering the courage she had learned from Billy. "No, father, it wasn't luck. It was vision, and I learned that vision from someone you despise." Edward looked up, anger mixing with something he didn't recognize. Uncertainty. Charlotte continued, "You forbade me to learn from Billy, but he was the one who taught me to see. And today, for the first time, I am not just your daughter, I am myself." The words echoed through the hall, breaking the ice that had always dominated the mansion. Edward rose slowly, as if the weight of his own arrogance was weighing him down. And for the first time, Charlotte saw not the ruthless tycoon, but a man wavering before his own daughter. Betty entered the room at that moment, a shy gleam of hope in her eyes. She had overheard part of the conversation and feared reprisals. But Charlotte stood up and walked towards her, positioning herself as a human shield. "If my voice cannot protect them, Father, then this victory on the board will. Billy and Betty stay. They're part of my life, whether I like it or not." Edward's breathing quickened, and his hand clenched on the table, as if fighting his own fury. But instead of exploding, he just stared at Charlotte silently, unable to formulate an immediate response. Billy, who had been watching hidden, stepped forward, his face calm, but his eyes shining with courage. "Mr. Kingsley, I never meant any disrespect. I only wanted to help Charlotte find what was already inside her." The words, simple, echoed with unexpected force. Edward looked away, unable to look at the boy. It was as if that gesture of courage had dismantled his oldest defenses. Charlotte sat back down, the board still before her, a symbol of her first great victory. He felt the invisible barriers of the house begin to crumble. The walls of silence and fear, built over the years, now showed cracks. The father had not yet completely given in, but his power was no longer absolute. There was a new space in the air, space for dialogue, for change. Charlotte looked at Betty and Billy and smiled slightly, as if to say without words, "We're winning." And in that instant he realized, it wasn't just about protecting the Carters. It was about rescuing one's own soul from the prison in which it lived. Edward, too proud to admit it, turned and left the hall. But his silence was no longer the same. It was no longer one of power, but of defeat. And Charlotte knew this was just the beginning of the true transformation. The fall of the barriers had begun. And from then on, nothing would ever be the same again. The Kingsley mansion dawned in silence, but not the heavy silence it always had. It was a new silence, filled with expectation. Charlotte walked down the hallway with firm steps, feeling that something profound had changed the night before. In the living room, he found Edward standing before the fireplace, his eyes fixed on an old photo of himself when he was still young. His gaze was distant, as if he finally saw cracks in his own wall of pride. When he noticed his daughter's presence, he didn't speak immediately. She just took a deep breath, her voice quieter than Charlotte remembered. "Yesterday you defeated me, Charlotte, but not on the board. It was here," he said, touching his chest. Charlotte approached, surprised by her father's rare vulnerability. He turned slowly, and his usual hardness seemed to have dissolved into something more human. "I haven't seen you or heard you in so long, and it took a 13-year-old boy to show me that." Charlotte felt her eyes well up. For the first time, there was no contempt in her voice, there was recognition. At that moment, Betty entered with Billy, hesitantly, as if waiting for the order to be expelled. Edward looked at them, and the room seemed to stop in time. The tycoon took a deep breath, his eyes fixed on the boy. "Billy Carter," he said, his voice firm but without hostility. "You broke my rules, but you saved something I thought was lost. My daughter." The boy held his gaze, with the calm that always accompanied him. "Mr. Kingsley, I only showed Charlotte what was already inside her." The silence that followed was broken by Edward in an unexpected gesture. He approached Betty and said simply, "You're not going anywhere. This house is yours too." Betty put her hand to her mouth in surprise. Charlotte ran to Billy and hugged him tightly, as if she wanted to share this invisible victory with him. Edward turned to his daughter, his eyes firm but gentle. "Let this be the beginning of something new, Charlotte. Maybe I need to learn to see too." It was the most honest confession Edward had made in years. That night, the four gathered in the moonlit garden. Charlotte, Billy, and Edward played a friendly game of chess, while Betty watched with a smile. There were no winners or losers, just shy laughter and the feeling that walls were being torn down. Charlotte looked at Billy, who, with his usual simplicity, seemed unaware of the greatness of what he had done. He hadn't just changed his life, he had forever transformed the Kingsley legacy. And deep down, Charlotte knew that this was just the beginning of a new story, in which learning to see would be the greatest victory of all. As the pieces on the board were moved under the starry sky, she felt that, for the first time, she was not carrying the weight alone. He had allies, he had a purpose, and he had found in Billy Carter, the cleaning lady's son, the greatest lesson of his life. A lesson that no empire, no matter how great, could erase. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any inspiring stories, And of course, leave a like, because that really helps the channel continue to bring you moving stories like this. Thank you so much for your support.